The air in the office that night was thick and cold, even though it was late May. It was 11:03 p.m., and I was sitting at my cheap particle board desk, the only light on in the entire administration wing of Northwood High. I'm Walker, by the way. I was supposed to be gone 4 hours ago, but you know how it goes. That particular night, I wasn't feeling the usual bitter exhaustion. Nope. I was humming a little tune under my breath, which was totally insane given the circumstances, but I was about to drop a single digital hammer that was going to echo through the school's administration for the entire weekend. I was staring at two file icons on my screen side by side. The first was named Q3 Budget Reconciliation _file shares for approved.xlsx. This one was clean. Perfect. I'd spent 40 hours, my actual contracted hours, getting it there. It was the report that the big bosses, Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris, had reviewed, scanned for their signatures, and then told me to finalize and send first thing Friday morning. Translation: Walker, finish this up, then email it out before you leave tonight so we don't have to think about it until Monday. The second file was my masterpiece. I'd named it Q3 Budget Reconciliation _draft _working _v1.7 clean.x. This one was a nightmare. It had the correct totals on the front page, just enough to pass a casual glance, but every single linked sheet, the granular data on student fees, textbook purchasing, and the notoriously complicated athletic department slush fund, was wrong. Not just slightly off either. I'm talking about revenue numbers transposed as expenses, fund allocations that belong to 2018, and a spectacular $85,000 deficit where there should have been a $30,000 surplus. It wasn't a mistake. It was a perfectly engineered time bomb of bureaucratic chaos, designed to unravel the moment anyone tried to drill down on the data. And the best part? It had the exact same digital signature block on the cover sheet as the final, correct one. Because they signed off on the concept of the final report, not the actual data in the final report. My finger hovered over the attach button in the email draft. The recipients were already listed: Albright, the queen of early exit, and Harris, the king of delegation, plus two high-up district officials who always checked their work emails on Saturday mornings, just for a little power trip. This single email, sent at this ungodly hour, was a poison dart aimed right at their precious, uninterrupted weekend. I'd spent countless late nights, countless hours of my personal life, fueling their early exits and their long weekends. Tonight, I was reclaiming my time, and with extreme prejudice. I remember thinking, is this too much? Is risking my job, my whole career in administration, worth the sweet, sweet taste of revenge? The thought lasted about half a second, maybe less. Then I remembered the specific pain of the night before when I missed my little brother's school play, a play he'd been practicing for months, all because Ms. Albright decided the color codes on a seating chart needed to be personally verified by me at 6:45 p.m. She told me without looking up from her phone, "It'll only take a minute, Walker. You have to be a team player." She was already in her coat. Team player. Right. That memory settled the whole argument. I dragged the corrupted file, the one with the $85,000 black hole, into the attachment window. The file name was harmless, professional even. The contents were pure, unadulterated hell. I typed a simple, utterly benign message. "Hi all, per Ms. Albright / Mr. Harris's request, please see the Q3 Budget Reconciliation Report attached. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, Walker." The lie was not in the message, but in the attachment. The subtle cruelty was in the timing. I waited until the clock ticked to 11:15 p.m. What? Because that's late enough that they'd already be tucked into their beds, totally switched off, and early enough that those district officials would catch it first thing in the morning, putting Albright and Harris immediately on the defensive. It's all about the timing. It's all about the pressure. I took a deep breath, the kind you take before jumping into a cold pool, and pressed send. The satisfying whoosh sound of the email client confirmed the launch. I sat back in my chair and let out a laugh that was maybe a little too maniacal for a school office, even an empty one. It was done. The dominoes were set. And I was about to have my first truly free, truly stress-free weekend in 6 months. I imagined Ms. Albright's face when her Saturday morning coffee was interrupted by a panicked call from the superintendent's office. I imagined Mr. Harris, who always bragged about his weekend golfing trips, having to cancel his tea time. The thought was better than any vacation. And hey, I want to know when you started listening to this story. You've heard the hook, the moment I committed the crime. Drop a comment below and tell me what time and what day you're watching this video right now. I'm curious to see when this story finds you. I logged off the system, making sure to clear my browser history, not because I'd done anything wrong on the internet, but because an overly zealous HR department is always watching. I gathered my things, pulled my jacket on, and walked toward the main doors. The hallway was completely dark, the rows of student lockers silent and imposing. It felt like walking out of a tomb, only I was the one who had finally woken up. As I pushed the heavy glass door open and the cool night air hit my face, I had a sudden, overwhelming sense of liberation. This wasn't just revenge, it was a desperate, maybe ill-advised but necessary act of self-preservation. I left the building, the emergency lights casting long shadows behind me, ready to enjoy the most anticipated weekend of my adult life. Now, the setup, how I got to this point, that's where the real story begins. So, how did I, Walker, a guy who genuinely enjoys organization and color coding, end up committing an act of corporate sabotage in a high school administration office? It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing grind. I joined the Northwood High School admin team 6 months before that fateful Friday night. I was fresh out of my administrative certification course, full of idealism about supporting education and keeping the gears turning smoothly. The setting itself, the school office, was actually a perfect symbol of my shattered dreams. It was supposed to be the buzzing heart of the school, but after 5 p.m., it became the school office graveyard. The main office area was huge, an open-plan nightmare dominated by 3 imposing desks arranged in a sort of hierarchy. Mine was the one nearest the filing cabinets, shoved against the wall, the administrative Siberia. The other 2 belonged to Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris. The air was perpetually dry, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial-strength Lysol. During the day, it was a cacophony of ringing phones, student chatter, and the screech of the laminating machine. But after 5 p.m., a silence would descend that felt heavier than the day's noise. It was the sound of my colleagues vanishing and me being left with the entire weight of the evening's tasks. My job title was something convoluted like Administrative Support Specialist for Financial and Curricular Logistics, which basically meant I did everything that was boring, tedious, or required serious attention to detail. I handled the quarterly budget reports, reconciled the massive piles of purchase orders, processed the student enrollment changes, and managed the substitute teacher scheduling. It was a 3-person workload, and for the first 3 months, I genuinely thought I was proving my worth by tackling it all. I was the eager beaver, the one who took the tasks with a smile and a sure no problem. The reality of the office culture set in fast. Ms. Albright, the senior administrative assistant, was in her mid-50s, possessed an intimidatingly perfect haircut, and treated the filing system like a sacred, ancient text. She didn't do heavy lifting. Her expertise was in oversight and delegation. Mr. Harris, a few years younger, was the financial manager who believed his time was too valuable for anything less than a spreadsheet with 5 figures or more. He spent most of his afternoon on personal calls, loudly discussing his fantasy football league, and then signing off on my meticulously prepared reports without even opening the attachments. They were the established veterans and I was the fresh meat, and they knew exactly how to carve me up. The routine was brutal and, in retrospect, completely choreographed. It wasn't about emergencies, it was about efficiency, their efficiency. At 4:30 p.m., right when I was usually tying up my final tasks for the day, one of them would stroll over to my desk. "Walker, before you head out," Ms. Albright would start, her tone a sickly sweet blend of apology and command, "could you just get these 150 standardized test forms scanned and indexed? They need to go to the district tonight, and you're the only one who really knows the new system." This was a job that took a minimum of 2 hours, and she knew it. It was usually accompanied by a stack of paperwork that threatened to topple over. Or Mr. Harris would drop a thick binder with a sigh. "Walker, this Q3 reconciliation needs one last pass. Just verify all the fund codes against the ledger before you send it. Shouldn't take more than an hour or 2. I'd do it, but I've got a critical appointment." That critical appointment was always picking up his dry cleaning or meeting his golf buddies. Notice the wording, "before you head out." It was always phrased as a small request to cap off the day, not a mandatory task that would keep me chained to my desk past dinner time. They never ordered me to stay. They just created a completely impossible scenario where not staying meant failure, and failure meant their weekend, or maybe even their jobs, was jeopardized. And I, the naive newbie, felt the crushing weight of that implied responsibility. I was the human firewall protecting them from consequences. I started staying later and later. 5:30 p.m. turned into 6:30 p.m. 6:30 p.m. turned into 8 p.m. I'd eat sad, cold meals at my desk, listening to the janitor's vacuum cleaner whine in the distance. I remember one night, around 9 p.m., I was struggling with a complex payroll error, and I emailed Mr. Harris for a quick clarification. He replied instantly, "Out to dinner. Check the manual." This was a man who, 5 minutes earlier, had been complaining loudly about traffic as he walked out the door at 4:58 p.m. That was a huge turning point for me. It wasn't just work. It was a total disrespect for my time, my life, and me as a human being. I started to feel less like an employee and more like a hired indentured servant. My social life shriveled up. I missed birthday parties, gym sessions, and just simple, quiet evenings at home. I was permanently exhausted, perpetually smelling of stale coffee, and beginning to harbor a deep, simmering resentment. They used me as a buffer against all the unpleasant, time-consuming realities of their own jobs. This wasn't a team, it was a hierarchy of exploitation. And the worst part? They always seemed so genuinely relieved when they left, thanking me with that hollow, performative gratitude that just twisted the knife. "You're a lifesaver, Walker." Ms. Albright would chirp, already halfway out the door, her handbag swinging. Little did they know the lifesaver was about to capsize their boat. The scene was set, the routine was established, and the deep, personal frustration was boiling over. The two kingpins of the administration wing, Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris, weren't malicious in the classic, cackling villain sense. They were something far more common and frankly far more irritating. They were masters of sophisticated laziness and emotional manipulation. They were like two high-functioning corporate vampires, subtly draining the energy and time from anyone below them, all while maintaining a veneer of professional competence. They were the primary characters in my daily drama, and understanding their routine was key to my eventual strike. Ms. Albright was the face of the operation. She dressed impeccably, power suits, expensive jewelry, and a scent of expensive perfume that somehow vanished the second she clocked out. Her entire identity was tied up in being the indispensable, organized senior admin. She was obsessed with appearances. Her desk was always spotless, her calendar perfectly color-coded, and she had a habit of talking about synergy and proactive engagement at every single staff meeting. But behind the facade of perfection was a deep-seated aversion to any task that required more than 15 minutes of sustained concentration. The moment something became truly complicated, like reconciling a mismatched ledger or drafting a policy memo, it would magically migrate to my desk. Her signature move, the one that used to make my blood pressure spike, was the urgent folder drop. Around 4:45 p.m. she'd sashay over, smile brightly, and drop a heavy manila folder on my corner with a cheerful, "Oh, Walker, can you just take a quick peek at this? It's for the superintendent, so it needs to be perfect before you leave." The folder would invariably contain 3 hours of work she hadn't touched all day. Then there was Mr. Harris. He was less about public performance and more about pure, unadulterated time theft. He was the financial manager, meaning he held the keys to the kingdom of numbers, but he seemed to view those keys as a license to play. His desk was always a controlled chaos of expensive golf magazines, receipts for lavish office supply lunches, which he never invited me to, and his ever-present phone. He never actually seemed to do the finances. He supervised them. And by supervise, I mean he waited for me to finish a report, skimmed the executive summary, and signed the bottom line. He was the king of delegation, issuing his decrees with a breezy confidence that suggested I was lucky to even be allowed to execute his brilliant vision. One memorable interaction cemented my deep distrust of his work ethic. I was struggling with a huge discrepancy in the textbook budget, something like a $12,000 variance. I went to him, laid out the facts, and asked for his input. He glanced at the spreadsheet, didn't even tap a single key, and said, "Well, Walker, you're the detail person. Just make the numbers work. I trust your judgment." He then went back to watching a YouTube video on how to improve his golf swing. Make the numbers work. That phrase was the unofficial motto of the department. It meant, fix my mess, do my job, and take the fall if anything goes wrong. The decree they both operated under was simple. My time is finite and valuable. Your time, Walker, is infinite and disposable. This dynamic wasn't just a matter of poor management, it was a psychological operation. They created a constant low-level state of urgency around my work that never existed for theirs. When they asked me to stay late, they framed it as a heroic effort, an essential sacrifice for the team. Ms. Albright would say things like, "You are truly the backbone of this office, Walker. We could not survive without you handling the deep-dive tasks." Mr. Harris would nod, "Keep burning that midnight oil, son. It's how you move up." But I wasn't moving up. I was digging myself deeper into an administrative trench. I was doing their work and they were collecting the paycheck and the praise. They were the commanders, getting medals for battles I was fighting alone in the dark. I remember one particularly egregious example involving the school's annual accreditation report. It was a massive, binder-breaking document that required pulling data from every single department. Ms. Albright assigned it to me on a Monday morning with the deadline being that Friday. "It's critical, Walker," she stressed. "Absolute top priority. You must be available." I canceled all my personal plans. I worked through lunch every day. By Thursday I was a zombie. I finally finished the final, meticulously formatted report at 9:30 p.m. on Thursday night. When I came in on Friday, relieved and exhausted, ready for my hard-earned weekend, I saw Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris chatting by the coffee machine. "Morning, Walker. Did you get that report finalized?" Albright asked casually. "Yes, Ms. Albright. Sent it to your desktop just before I left last night," I replied, trying not to sound completely dead inside. "Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much," she said, and then to Mr. Harris in a louder voice, "See, Larry? We told them we'd have it done by Friday morning and we delivered. Another smooth accreditation year, thanks to our fantastic team management." That was the kicker. Their team management. Their delivery. I was just the invisible drone. That morning, watching them congratulate themselves over a cup of free office coffee, I had a revelation. They weren't going to change. They had zero incentive to change. The system was perfectly designed to let them coast and let me sink. The only way to stop the bleed was to make the system stop working for them. I needed to create a monumental administrative earthquake, and I needed to do it using their one shared weakness, their unwavering, blind faith in my ability to handle every single detail perfectly. They trusted me because it was convenient to trust me. I decided I would shatter that convenience permanently. The moment the clock hit 5:01 p.m. was truly the hour of dread. It wasn't the sound of a bell or a buzzer. It was the sudden, palpable shift in atmosphere, like a pressure valve closing on my chest. From 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris were tolerable. They were focused, they engaged in superficial water-cooler chat, and they generally kept up the pretense of being busy professionals. But the second that clock ticked over, their masks slipped, and the casual dismissal of my personal time began. The ritual was always the same, and it was a masterpiece of passive aggression. They would spend the last 10 minutes leading up to 5 o'clock on a carefully staged, synchronized wind-down. Ms. Albright would be sorting her desk, arranging her pristine pens and loudly proclaiming, "Oh, thank heavens it's almost time. I've got a massive evening planned with my book club/gardening society/yoga instructor." It was always a reminder that her life was rich, vibrant, and crucially started promptly at 5. Mr. Harris was less subtle. He would start saving and closing all his files at 4:50 p.m., making sure the click-clack of his keyboard keys was loud enough to be heard across the office. Then, exactly at 4:55 p.m., he'd pick up his phone and start a loud, personal conversation with his wife about traffic, dinner, and whatever expensive thing he was planning to buy that weekend. It was the auditory signal. I am mentally checked out. I am physically leaving. Then came the transfer of work. At 5:01 p.m., sometimes even a minute earlier, they would execute the handoff. It was rarely direct. It was always a staged discovery. Ms. Albright would suddenly realize a crucial document was missing or that a last-minute email from the principal had just dropped into her inbox, demanding an immediate response. She would come over to my desk, her coat already draped over her arm, a look of faux panic on her face. "Walker, oh, I am so terribly sorry, but I completely forgot about this," she'd exclaim, holding up a dense, multi-page document that had clearly been sitting on her desk since Tuesday. "It's the final student-teacher placement roster. It has to be cross-referenced with the faculty HR file tonight. The district needs it at 8 a.m. sharp and I just cannot possibly miss my event. Could you please? You're so much faster at the cross-referencing than I am." The implied pressure was crushing. It wasn't "could you do this?" It was "you must do this or the entire student placement system collapses and it will be your fault." Her fake concern, the sigh, the hand on my shoulder, was just a way to soften the blow of the command. Immediately after, Mr. Harris would swoop in for his turn, often waiting by the door. "Good night, Walker," he'd call out cheerfully, already halfway out. But then he'd pause, turn back and add with a weary sigh, "Oh hey, did you manage to clear out those quarter-end budget variances yet?" "No." Well, I need to get the final sign-off to District Central by 9 a.m. tomorrow, so if you could just spend an extra hour or two on it, that would be a huge help." "Great work, man. See you Monday." The beauty of their combined maneuver was that it always guaranteed I had a minimum of 2 hours of unplanned, highly detailed, and completely exhausting work waiting for me the second they walked out the door. The moment they left, the air would clear of their perfume and cologne, but it would fill instead with the stifling expectation of the unpaid overtime they demanded. I remember staring at my screen one evening around 7:30 p.m. I was trying to manually fix a complex error in the substitute payroll system. My dinner, a lukewarm cup of instant noodles, sat neglected next to my keyboard. I felt the deep, bone-weary fatigue that comes from being perpetually exploited. And then I noticed their desks. Ms. Albright's was perfectly clean, a monument to a workday efficiently ended. Mr. Harris's was still a mess, but his desk chair was perfectly tucked in, a clear declaration that he wasn't coming back. They had zero intention of ever returning to assist with the mess they had left me. The ultimate betrayal was the shift in their eyes. When they were leaving, the second they realized I was trapped by the work they had dumped on me, their polite, professional expressions would morph into a fleeting, almost imperceptible look of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the look of someone who had just successfully dodged a bullet, knowing full well that an innocent bystander had been hit instead. That look, that moment of silent, knowing self-congratulation, was what really fueled my resentment. It wasn't just that they made me work late, it was that they did it consciously, repeatedly, and with absolute moral impunity. They saw me as a tool, not a colleague, and the moment they were safe for the evening, the tool was discarded until morning. This toxic routine had turned my enthusiasm into cynicism and my patience into a ticking clock. I was not just overworked, I was emotionally drained by the predictable cycle of being dismissed. I was trapped in their system and I knew the only way out wasn't to complain. Complaining would make me the bad guy, but to break the system itself. And the key to breaking it, as I realized while eating those cold noodles, was going to be weaponizing the very thing they valued the most. Their own negligence, their own blind trust. They signed off on my work without checking. I needed to give them something so toxic to sign off on that they would never risk it again. The dread of 5:01 p.m. was about to be replaced by the dread of an entirely different kind of clock. The administrative trenches I was forced to dig myself into every night were not just emotionally draining, they were becoming literally suffocating. The sheer volume of work they dumped on me was impossible for one person to manage perfectly, especially under the pressure of a late-night deadline. This was the stacks of unchecked paperwork, a physical manifestation of their disregard. I handled two main categories of misery: budget reports and student records. The budget reports, Mr. Harris's specialty, were always the worst. We're talking quarterly reconciliations that involved thousands of line items, multiple funding sources, state, federal, private grants, parent-teacher association funds, and a dizzying number of alphanumeric codes. Every single report needed to be cross-checked against the main ledger. This wasn't a job you could rush. A single misplaced decimal point or transposed fund code could lead to the district freezing a massive grant or, even worse, triggering an audit. Yet every Thursday Mr. Harris would slide the binders over saying, "Just confirm these figures, Walker." Quick sanity check. A sanity check that took 4 hours. Ms. Albright's contributions were the student records, the enrollment packets, transfer requests, standardized testing forms, and disciplinary reports. These weren't numbers, these were people, and the stakes were higher. A mistake here could mean a student was placed in the wrong class, missed a crucial scholarship deadline, or worst of all, had their private information sent to the wrong parent or agency. These stacks were the most physically imposing, towering piles of color-coded folders that stretched from the corner of my desk halfway to the floor. I remember one night, I literally had to use my elbow to keep a stack of late enrollment forms from sliding onto the floor as I tried to type. That was my life, bracing myself against their neglect. The problem wasn't just the quantity, it was the lack of accountability after I finished. I was spending 3 to 5 hours a night creating perfect reports, only for them to be signed off on in under 60 seconds. They didn't read them. They didn't review them. They simply took the final printout, slapped their electronic signature on it, and forwarded it to the higher-ups. Their confidence in my work was a complete illusion, a form of intellectual laziness masquerading as trust. I recall one Friday night particularly vividly. I was finishing the annual supply inventory report, a grueling task of counting everything from reams of printer paper to boxes of safety goggles. It was past 9 p.m. and I was so tired I was seeing double. Mr. Harris had left me a note. Urgent. Inventory report must be emailed to facilities tomorrow a.m. Don't leave until it's done. The checks. As I was printing the final version, I noticed a tiny, almost comical error. I had accidentally logged 500 bottles of crocodile dung sunscreen, instead of coconut-scented hand sanitizer, in the system's inventory list for the maintenance closet. It was a leftover placeholder name from a previous silly joke with a friend, and I'd missed deleting it. It was completely absurd. The total cost was the same, so the budget wasn't affected, but anyone reading the actual line item would stop and say, "Wait, what?" Normally, I would have painstakingly logged back in and corrected the error. But that night, fueled by instant coffee and sheer spite, I paused. I looked at the line item. $450, 500 units, sunscreen, crocodile dung, SPF 50. And then I left it. I hit print, stapled the report, and left it on Mr. Harris's desk, right under the bolded line that demanded his signature. My reasoning was simple. If he was truly doing a quick sanity check, he would see the ridiculous line item and pull me up on it. It was a microscopic test of his attention, a little piece of administrative sabotage designed not to cause damage, but to confirm my suspicions. I walked in Monday morning with a mix of dread and anticipation. Mr. Harris was at his desk, cheerful as always. I waited. Did he mention the sunscreen? Did he even blink? Morning, Walker. That inventory report was great, smooth as silk. Got it sent right off. They loved the budget projection, he chirped. Not a word about the mythical crocodile dung sunscreen. Not a single question. He had signed the report, the one that swore the school was stocking 500 bottles of completely fictional, bizarrely named sunscreen, without reading a single line item past the summary total. That moment was profoundly clarifying. It solidified the depth of their negligence. They weren't just delegating, they were completely abdicating their responsibility. They were signing documents that were legally binding and financially sensitive, based solely on the fact that I had prepared them. The $450 worth of fake sunscreen confirmed two things. First, they wouldn't notice a giant error unless it was pointed out with a megaphone, and second, any mistake I made, accidental or otherwise, was automatically sanctioned by their signatures. They had created a situation where I held all the technical power, and they held only the ceremonial authority. It was the perfect weakness to exploit. If I could hide a joke item, I could certainly hide a catastrophic financial blunder. The system was flawed, and I had just found the crack wide enough to drive a truck through. The time for subtle tests was over. The time for action was approaching. After the crocodile dung sunscreen incident, I stopped being just a resentful employee and started being an observer of human negligence. The small, intentional errors, the tiny glitches I left in obscure spreadsheets, became my private scientific experiment. I was testing the depth of their disinterest. And the results were conclusive. Ms. Albright and Mr. Harris were operating on a faith-based system of administration. They signed, therefore it was true. I began to see the massive budget report, the very document that would become my weapon, not as a tedious task but as a digital canvas. I was preparing the real one during my normal work hours, ensuring every line was meticulous and correct. But during the late hours, fueled by the injustice of the situation, I started crafting its evil twin. This was the moment the moral tug-of-war began raging inside me. On one side was Good Walker, the professional, the ethical administrative assistant. He argued that this kind of sabotage was extreme. You'll ruin your career over a few late nights, Walker. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Find another job, document the abuse, report them to HR. This was the voice of reason and self-preservation. It kept me up at night, worrying about background checks and reference letters. I actually drafted an email to HR 3 different times, detailing the hours, the emotional stress, and the fact that I was doing the work of 3 people. But every time I reviewed the draft, I deleted it. Why? Because I knew the corporate dance. HR wouldn't see it as unfair labor. They'd see it as a personality conflict, or worse, me being unable to handle the rigors of the role. I'd be labeled the problem, the complainer, and they, the established managers, would get a gentle reminder to document delegation better. The system was rigged to protect the people at the top, not the drone on the floor. On the other side was Revenge Walker, the exhausted, fed-up guy who'd missed his brother's play and canceled countless dates and commitments. He was the one who kept repeating Mr. Harris's words in a cold, metallic echo. Just make the numbers work, Walker. This voice was dark, but compelling. It said, they abused their power, you should use the power they blindly gave you. This isn't about revenge, it's about calibration. It's about teaching them that there are actual consequences to their negligence. The goal wasn't to get them fired, not initially anyway. The goal was to inflict a pain commensurate with the stress they had inflicted on me, a pain that centered on the one thing they valued most, their leisure time. The tipping point, the moment Revenge Walker won the war, was actually very mundane. It was a Tuesday. I had stayed until 10:15 p.m. fixing a major error in the school bus routing system that Ms. Albright had conveniently overlooked. I finally got home, utterly drained, and realized I had completely missed my weekly standing phone call with my grandmother. She lives 3 states away and that call is sacred to us. She was worried sick because I never miss it. When I finally called her back, her voice, soft and frail, asked, "Everything all right, dear? Are you getting enough sleep?" I lied, of course, telling her it was a sudden emergency. Hanging up, I felt a deep, piercing wave of sadness. My dedication to this job, no, my enslavement to their laziness, was actively eroding the meaningful parts of my life. That night, I realized I had been allowing them to steal my life minute by minute, phone call by phone call. They weren't just stealing company time, they were stealing my time, my energy, my connection to the outside world. The moral dilemma dissolved instantly. I was no longer fighting for professional ethics. I was fighting for self-respect. I went back to my computer that Tuesday night and pulled up the correct Q3 budget reconciliation report. Then I opened a new file, the one I named draft_working_V1.7_clean, and began the meticulous, calculated process of corruption. I wasn't randomly changing numbers. I was introducing logical inconsistencies. For example, I took the revenue from the school cafeteria's a la carte sales, which was actually performing very well, and categorized it under a rarely used expenditure code for future technology upgrades. Then, I took a massive grant intended for special education programming and made it appear as a miscellaneous uncategorized deposit. The overall balance on the front page looked okay, but the moment anyone tried to trace the funds through the linked schedules, the entire financial map of the school would turn into a Gordian knot of errors. It looked professional, it was formatted perfectly, but it was fundamentally and explosively wrong. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy. This wasn't anger, it was pure, surgical intent. I was building the perfect trap. And their signature, their blind sign-off, was going to be the lever that sprung it. They wanted to trust me implicitly? Fine. I would give them something to implicitly trust, something that would teach them a lesson they would never, ever forget. I just needed the right moment, the right report, and the right time to strike. And that moment, I knew, was fast approaching. The moral fight was over, and the plan had moved from theoretical resentment to practical execution. The final, definitive moment that pushed me over the edge into full-blown sabotage was, ironically, the moment they acted their most human. It was the day I had to miss my family dinner, the one my parents held every month. I had already warned them I might be late, but when 5 p.m. rolled around, the sheer mountain of work meant late was off the table. It was officially canceled. That Friday afternoon, Ms. Albright cornered me at 4:55 p.m., looking genuinely stressed, which was unusual. "Walker, the new expense report system just crashed. The district needs the reconciliation file from this morning resent via the old portal before 6 p.m., or we lose access for the weekend. I just got off the phone with my son, he's in the emergency room, minor thing, but I have to go now. Please just handle this one last thing. You're the only one who can navigate that archaic portal." She looked frantic, and for a fleeting second I felt bad. This felt like a genuine crisis, not their usual manufactured urgency. But then as she rushed out, Mr. Harris sauntered over. "Rough day for Albright, huh?" he said, zipping up his expensive briefcase. "Look, I was supposed to fix that portal thing, but honestly I can't be bothered. Good of you to jump in. See you Monday. Great work ethic, Walker." And with a careless wave, he was gone, completely undermining any sympathy I had for the situation. Albright had the emergency, but Harris had the opportunity to help and chose his weekend instead. It was a perfect two-pronged attack of necessity and selfishness that cemented my decision. That night, alone in the silent, dark office, the only light coming from my monitor, I felt a deep, cool resolve. I wasn't doing this to get them fired, not exactly. I was doing this to get my life back. This was the decision to strike back, and I was going to use the Q3 budget reconciliation report, the most critical, time-sensitive document of the quarter, as my weapon. I worked methodically on the corrupted report, the one with the bizarre file name, ensuring it looked exactly like the final, approved version. The key was the signatures. On Thursday they had both proudly signed off on the draft I'd shown them, the one with the correct totals on the front page, but they hadn't actually reviewed the complex, underlying sheets. They had literally signed the digital dotted line, electronically sanctioning the report. All I had to do was copy those signed front pages onto my corrupted data file. The process of sabotage felt like a high-stakes, administrative heist. I spent the next 2 hours fine-tuning the chaos. I created an entirely new column in the student transportation budget, mislabeling it as a discretionary maintenance fund. I then allocated $30,000 to this new fund, sourced directly from the technology upgrades budget, making it look like a severe accounting error, a massive oversight that a trained financial manager should have caught immediately. It wasn't just wrong, it was obvious to anyone who actually looked. The error was so simple, so fundamental, that it would scream negligence on their part for approving it. I specifically targeted the areas they had claimed to have reviewed thoroughly. Mr. Harris had spent 10 minutes bragging about how he personally vetted the Title I grant figures. So, I took the Title I grant revenue and shifted it into the account for staff holiday party planning, an account that typically only contained a few $100s. This created a colossal flashing red light on the report, a massive federal grant seemingly diverted to catering and balloons. As I worked, I kept thinking about the look on my grandmother's face, the disappointment in my brother's voice, the sheer exhaustion in my own reflection. Every transposed number, every shifted fund, was a reclaiming of a minute they had stolen from me. I finished the swap at 10:45 p.m. The two files were now identical in name with one slight difference. The true, correct report was safely zipped and hidden in a secure, rarely accessed archive folder on my desktop, named "Do Not Open Until Monday." The corrupted, explosive version was sitting innocently on my desktop, ready for launch. The adrenaline was pumping. It wasn't fear, it was the intoxicating rush of true agency. For 6 months, I had been the passive recipient of their demands. Tonight, I was the one controlling the narrative. I wrote the final email to Albright, Harris, and the two high-ranking district officials as I mentioned in Section 1. The message was concise, professional, and entirely deceptive. Per Ms. Albright/Mr. Harris's request, please see the Q3 Budget Reconciliation Report attached. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, Walker. The lie was silent, hidden inside the spreadsheet. It was the best kind of lie, one that used the truth of their negligence to inflict maximum damage. The stage was set for the midnight switch, the final, unforgivable action that would send them scrambling through their weekend plans and finally give me the peace I deserved. I double-checked the recipients, took one last look at the perfectly crafted financial disaster, and hovered my finger over the send button. There was no going back. The email was drafted, the corrupted file was attached, and the recipients were locked in. I had 2 minutes until the perfect moment. This wasn't just about hitting send. This was about maximizing the blast radius. I knew the district officials, Mr. Henderson and Ms. Chavez, often checked their work phones right before bed or first thing in the morning, the classic workaholic move. Sending it at exactly 11:59 p.m. on a Friday was the strategic masterstroke. It was late enough that Albright and Harris would be sound asleep, completely disconnected and defenseless. But it was early enough that the high-level officials would wake up to it. I sat back in the silence, the only sound the whirring of the server tower tucked away in the closet. I felt like a spy in a movie, having just planted the bomb and waiting for the timer to run out. This was the midnight switch, the final, unforgivable action. I had meticulously reviewed the correct report one last time, zipped it up, and placed it deep into the archive folder, my insurance policy. Now the fraudulent report sat exposed on my desktop, its file name looking innocent, its data sheets hiding pure financial pandemonium. My heart was doing a frantic little drum solo against my ribs. There was a tiny voice, the ghost of Good Walker, whispering, "Stop. Delete the email. Go home." But then I remembered the long, empty evenings, the missed life events, the sheer contempt in Mr. Harris's voice when he told me, "I can't be bothered." That memory was the concrete wall that shielded me from doubt. I moved the mouse pointer over the send button. I didn't want to just press it, I wanted to experience the moment. I watched the digital clock in the corner of my screen. 11:57 p.m. I imagined Mr. Harris, probably asleep on his couch after watching a movie, dreaming of a golf course. I imagined Ms. Albright, perhaps sipping a glass of wine, congratulating herself on her efficiency for leaving the office a full 6 hours before me. They were enjoying the leisure I had sacrificed. They were asleep on my time. 11:58 p.m. This was it. I leaned forward. My hand was steady, surprisingly so. I was no longer driven by anger. I was driven by a cold, clear desire for parity. I wanted them to experience a fraction of the stress, the sudden, overwhelming panic of a deadline that was impossible to meet, a problem that had to be fixed immediately, and a consequence that was entirely their fault. I was about to weaponize their sign-offs. They signed it, they owned it. 11:59 p.m. I pressed send. The screen flashed the message sent, confirmation. That gentle, two-word notification was the administrative equivalent of a shockwave. I didn't immediately jump up and leave. I sat there for a full minute, watching the dark screen, letting the silence settle. I had just unleashed a 3-day administrative nightmare. The report I sent claimed that $30,000 of taxpayer money, earmarked for crucial technology upgrades for special needs students, had been mysteriously allocated to a non-existent discretionary staff travel fund. And the detail I was most proud of, a massive $85,000 deficit I had engineered, was listed as being fully approved and signed off by department heads in the executive summary. The email was now sitting in Mr. Henderson's inbox, ready for his 7 a.m. Saturday review. He was famously meticulous, and the second he saw a $30,000 misallocation and a six-figure deficit, he wouldn't call me. He would call the two people whose signatures were plastered all over the report, Albright and Harris. He wouldn't ask, "Did Walker make a mistake?" He would ask, "Why did you two sign off on this financial disaster?" I logged out of my computer and locked my desk drawers, making sure everything looked normal. The feeling of utter weightlessness was immediate. I wasn't just walking away from a shift, I was walking away from months of pent-up exploitation. I was free. As I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the exit, I smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smirk, it was a quiet, deep satisfaction. I was leaving the building, not with the crushing weight of unfinished work, but with the delicious anticipation of the chaos I had created. I knew my phone was going to be silent all weekend because if they had to fix a mistake of this magnitude, they wouldn't dare wake me up, the one person who supposedly knew how to fix the budget data. They'd have to scramble, desperately trying to reconcile the data, only to find that every linked sheet, every cross-reference, led to a dead end. They had signed off on my perfect report, now they had signed off on this perfect lie. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors and into the cool, silent air of midnight. My weekend was beginning, and theirs was ending before it even began. I pulled out my phone and switched it to airplane mode, the final glorious step of my self-declared time off. I took a deep breath of the free night air and headed to my car, already planning what I was going to do for the next 72 hours. It was going to be glorious. I woke up Saturday morning, not to the usual spike of anxiety that usually accompanied the start of a weekend, a lingering fear that I had forgotten some critical task, but to the pure, unadulterated sensation of freedom. I had slept a solid 9 hours, something I hadn't done since I started this job. My phone was still on airplane mode, nestled on my nightstand, a silent black brick of liberation. This was the glorious aftermath of the perfect trap is sprung. I made coffee, not with the hurried, desperate energy of a man fueling up for another battle, but with the slow, deliberate care of someone enjoying a genuine moment of peace. I sat on my couch and, for the first time in months, opened a novel instead of a spreadsheet. The world outside my small apartment was buzzing with Saturday activity, and I was part of it, not chained to the glowing rectangle of my work computer. I knew, however, that the chaos was unfolding. The district officials, Mr. Henderson and Ms. Chavez, would have logged in around 7:30 a.m. They would have opened my email and the subject line alone, Q3 Budget Reconciliation Report, would have been enough to grab their attention. But the content? The instant they clicked on the attachment and saw the executive summary, their Saturday was over. They wouldn't have even needed to scroll far to see the big flashing red light, the $85,000 deficit and the stunningly careless $30,000 reallocation from special ed tech to staff travel. Henderson would have immediately called Albright. She'd probably answer, groggy and irritated. The conversation would go something like this. "Ms. Albright, this Q3 report Walker sent, did you sign off on this? We have an $85,000 deficit and a Title I fund transferred to a holiday party account. This is a massive compliance issue. Did you review this?" Albright, who signed the report without looking, would have had to do the mental gymnastics of her life. She couldn't say, "No, I didn't look at it, I forced Walker to finish it at 10 p.m. and I signed the cover sheet only." That would expose her negligence immediately. Instead, she'd have to sputter, "Yes, of course I reviewed it. There must be an error in the data transfer. Let me get Mr. Harris on this immediately." And then the call to Mr. Harris. He would be on the first tee box about to swing his 5-iron. His face would go pale when Albright told him in a hushed, panicked tone that the report they signed had imploded. His golf game, his precious, uninterrupted leisure would be ruined. He too would have to lie to the district. "It's a data entry error, a quick fix. We'll get right on it." But here's the beautiful, cruel part of the trap. It wasn't a quick fix. My corrupted report was a work of artful destruction. Every number was logically linked, but incorrectly sourced. To fix it, they couldn't just change a cell value. They would have to trace the $30,000 transfer across 3 different heavily populated linked sheets, figure out why the numbers didn't balance against the general ledger, and then manually input the correct data from the real report, which of course they didn't have. They had no idea where I had hidden the real, clean report. They only had the bomb I had handed them, stamped with their own approval. They would spend Saturday morning trying to fix the obvious stuff, realizing quickly that the entire structure of the spreadsheet was fundamentally compromised. They'd likely try to call me the detail person, the one who knows the new system. That's when the airplane mode paid off. The phone would ring once, twice, a dozen times, going straight to a recorded message. I was unreachable. I was off the grid. I was probably attending to a personal emergency, or maybe I was just taking the time off they never allowed me to take. I imagined the two of them stuck in the empty, silent office, the very setting where they had inflicted so much administrative pain on me, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. They'd be huddled over a single monitor, their expensive weekend plans dissolving into a haze of financial spreadsheets and mutual blame. They were experiencing the 5:01 p.m. dread, but amplified by 1,000 and lasting for 48 hours. The irony was so potent I almost choked on my coffee. They were doing my work, but under infinitely worse conditions without my expertise, and with the immense pressure of the district breathing down their necks. They had created the monster, and now the monster was demanding its payment, their entire weekend. And I was absolutely, deliciously fine with that. Sunday was even better. The panic had morphed into desperation. I spent my day watching movies and ordering takeout, consciously refusing to think about spreadsheets. But I could feel the administrative meltdown happening 20 miles away. They were in the weeds, deep in the quicksand of corrupted data. Mr. Harris and Ms. Albright were not detail-oriented people. They were delegation people. When faced with a crisis of this complexity without the person they relied on me to fix it, they would be useless. I could picture the scene in my mind. The once pristine office was now a disaster zone. Empty coffee cups piled up. Mr. Harris would be running a printout of the corrupted report, highlighting errors with a furious red Sharpie, convinced the mistake was a simple typo. Ms. Albright would be on the phone, likely with her husband or a colleague from another school, desperately trying to find a high-level accounting shortcut that didn't exist. The air would be thick with their rising tension and the mutual, unspoken blame. They couldn't possibly call the IT department on a weekend for a budget reporting error, because that would expose them to another layer of scrutiny. They had to fix it themselves in secret, to cover up the fact that they signed off on a financial document that looked like it was created by a very spiteful toddler. The ultimate twist of the knife was that the correct report existed. It was right there in the archive folder on my desktop, which they could access if they knew the password. But they wouldn't look there. Why? Because they operate on a system of assumption. They assumed that the last file I sent, the one they told me to finalize and send, was the only file. They wouldn't suspect a deliberate swap. They would only suspect a terrible, career-ending error on their part for not checking. I had meticulously built this situation based on their character flaws. They never asked me to confirm the email I sent, they just told me to send the report. I never lied in my email, I just attached a different file. Everything I did was a direct reaction to their established pattern of negligence. They taught me to exploit their blind trust, and now they were learning the hard way why you shouldn't rely on one person to do the work of three without any oversight. The weekend culminated with me finally taking my phone off airplane mode Sunday evening, around 9 p.m. I had a backlog of texts from friends and family but nothing from work. Silence. Absolute, stunning silence. If they had fixed the problem, they would have been gleeful, texting me about the close call. The lack of communication meant one thing. They were still in the trenches, bleeding administrative sweat, and desperately trying to meet a Monday morning deadline they had imposed upon themselves. I went to bed early, feeling relaxed and calm. My mind was sharp, my body rested. I was ready for Monday and I knew exactly how I would play it. Monday morning. I strolled into the office at 7:58 a.m., 2 minutes early, professional as always. I had prepared my clothes carefully, a crisp, clean shirt, my hair neatly done. I needed to look like a man who had enjoyed a relaxing weekend, a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The scene that greeted me was pure gold. It was the Monday morning silence, but not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of people who have been awake for 48 hours and are barely holding on to their sanity. Ms. Albright was sitting at her desk, which was completely covered in printouts of spreadsheets. Her perfect hair was slightly mussed. She wasn't wearing a power suit, she was in a slightly wrinkled cardigan. She looked like she'd aged 5 years since Friday. Mr. Harris, slumped at his desk, was nursing a travel mug and staring blankly at his monitor. The golf magazines were gone. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't even have the energy to pretend to be busy. I walked to my desk, hung up my jacket, and offered a cheerful, completely sincere-sounding greeting. "Good morning, Ms. Albright." "Morning, Mr. Harris. Sleep well?" Albright flinched, physically recoiling at the question. Harris just grunted, not making eye contact. The tension was so thick I felt like I could cut it with a paper opener. I sat down, logged in, and opened my email. Within 30 seconds my phone pinged. It was an email from Mr. Henderson, the district official, with Ms. Chavez, Albright, and Harris CC'd. The subject line, Q3 reconciliation status. The body of the email was brief and pointed. "Mr. Harris, Ms. Albright, please confirm that the correct Q3 report was submitted this morning. The initial file we received on Friday night was completely unacceptable and has caused considerable concern. We expect a full breakdown of how such an error was approved and transmitted by 1 p.m. today. Walker, thank you for your patience." Walker, thank you for your patience. That was my cue. The district knew there was an error, and they had pointed the finger squarely at the ones who approved it. The two of them were ruined. They had to spend their entire weekend fixing my mistake just to get the corrected report in on Monday morning, and they were still facing a disciplinary investigation into their approval process. The silence in the office stretched on for what felt like an hour. Albright finally cleared her throat. "Walker, could you step into my office for a moment?" Her voice was thin, completely devoid of its usual authority. The power dynamic had flipped, decisively and permanently. I followed Ms. Albright into her small, glassed-in office. The air in there felt stale, still carrying the ghost scent of Friday's panic. Mr. Harris remained slumped at his desk, pretending to organize a stack of receipts, but his ears were clearly tuned to our conversation. This was the moment of confrontation, the twist and resolution beginning to take shape, but I knew I held all the cards. Albright closed the door, a completely unnecessary action since no one else was in the entire wing except the three of us. She didn't sit behind her massive desk, she stood, leaning against the edge, looking down at the ground. "Walker," she started, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, completely stripped of its usual cheerful veneer. "About the report you sent Friday night. The Q3 reconciliation." I met her eyes, bloodshot and deeply exhausted, with an expression of polite concern. "Yes, Ms. Albright? I sent the final file I was working on, the one you and Mr. Harris approved and signed off on." I emphasized the word "signed off on," letting it hang in the air like an accusation. She winced, then took a shaky breath. "Yes. Well, there appears to have been a catastrophic error in the data. A major transfer discrepancy. It was completely incorrect. You saw Mr. Henderson's email. We spent the entire weekend trying to rectify the situation before Monday morning. She was trying to frame it as a shared disaster, a generic error." "I'm so sorry to hear that, Ms. Albright," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "That must have been awful. I hope your son is feeling better, by the way." I threw that in just to remind her that I knew the real reason she had ditched the office Friday, and that I remembered every single detail of her life she had used as an excuse to leave me behind. The mention of her son flustered her. She waved a dismissive hand. Yes, he's fine. Look, Walker, what I need to know is, how did that specific, erroneous file get sent? We know you work so hard and you're always so careful. Was it a draft? A working version? Because frankly, it looks like a complete mess." This was the twist. They expected me to confess to a simple, accidental attachment mistake, which would allow them to pin the initial error on me, take the heat for the approval, and then move on. It would allow them to maintain the narrative that I screwed up, but they saved the day. I shook my head slowly, adopting an air of genuine confusion. "A working version? Ms. Albright, the file I sent was labeled Q3 budget reconciliation _final approved. It was the file that I finished, the one I put your and Mr. Harris's digital signatures on, the one you told me to send before I left Friday night." I paused, leaning in slightly, forcing her to confront the ugly truth. "I remember showing you the final page with the summary totals and your sign-off blocks Thursday afternoon. You looked at the total number, confirmed it was what you expected, and told me, and I quote, 'Send it out, Walker. You're the detail person. I trust you implicitly.'" The color drained completely from her face. She knew then that I wasn't playing the loyal, apologetic drone anymore. I had memorized her words. I was holding her accountable, not for the mistake, but for the implicit trust that had caused the disaster. "I only sent one email with that report Friday night," I continued, my voice calm, almost educational. "And since both of your approved electronic signatures were on the summary page, I assumed it was the final, approved version. If there were errors on the linked sheets that contradicted the front page summary you approved, I can only assume those errors were introduced after I had finished my final edits, or perhaps I missed a late-breaking adjustment instruction that you approved without my final input. It was the perfect deflection. I wasn't saying I didn't make a mistake, but I was forcing the blame back onto their lap. The core problem was that they had signed off on the document without reviewing the underlying data. My narrative made their lack of oversight the primary cause, and my mistake, the secondary, unprovable symptom. She opened her mouth about to argue, but she couldn't. She couldn't say, "I didn't look at it." That would confirm to the district that they were grossly negligent. She couldn't say, "You deliberately sent the wrong one," because there was no proof, and she would then have to explain why she and Harris had spent 48 hours manually fixing the file instead of just calling me. She looked utterly defeated. "So, you're saying that you believe you sent the correct file that night and this was some kind of unprecedented, catastrophic data corruption?" "I'm saying I sent the file that you both approved and asked me to send," I repeated, maintaining the perfect, frustrating loop of professional ambiguity. I did exactly what I was told to do. Perhaps the system glitched. Perhaps someone else accessed the file. But I left at midnight, and by then the report with your signatures had been successfully transmitted. The final, silent resolution was hammered home. They couldn't touch me. The district was investigating them for signing the error, not me for making it. They needed me now more than ever to handle the next report perfectly, or they would face another weekend from hell. Ms. Albright looked at me not with anger but with a terrifying, sudden understanding. She had met her match and she had lost. The long-form viral story wasn't just about revenge, it was about the power shift. The conversation in Ms. Albright's office ended not with a bang, but with a defeated sigh. She ran a hand through her already messy hair and stepped back from me. The silent exchange between us had been a declaration of war, followed by a negotiated peace treaty, a treaty where I held all the negotiating power. "All right, Walker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for clarifying. We'll follow up with the district regarding the approval process. For now, we need to focus on the next quarterly report. That deadline is fast approaching." "Of course, Ms. Albright," I replied, the perfect professional again. "I'm here to help in any way I can." I walked out of her office, feeling the heavy weight of Mr. Harris's gaze on my back. He didn't speak. He didn't even dare look up from his desk. He knew. He knew that I had either deliberately sabotaged them, or that my mistake had so perfectly exposed their negligence that the outcome was the same. Their entire weekend, their carefully protected time off, had been incinerated because of their own failure to check my work. The office had reached an unspoken truce. The change was immediate and profound. Starting that Monday, the atmosphere in the office was totally transformed. The frantic, synchronized wind down at 4:55 p.m.? It vanished. Instead, I saw Ms. Albright actually opening reports I sent her, not just the cover sheet but the linked data. She would ask pointed, intelligent questions about the sourcing of funds. Mr. Harris, the king of delegation, stopped discussing his golf game at 4:30 p.m. He started spending his afternoons, wait for it, working. I saw him manually reconciling purchase orders, a task he hadn't touched since I started the job. The infamous 5:01 p.m. dread was replaced with a kind of awkward, almost nervous collaboration. At 4:45 p.m. that Monday, instead of dropping a towering stack of forms on my desk with a demand for late-night work, Ms. Albright approached me carefully. "Walker," she said, genuinely meeting my eyes. "I'm closing out the enrollment files. Can you show me exactly where you pull the attendance data for the state report? I want to make sure I'm pulling the most current numbers before I leave." This wasn't a demand, it was a request for training. She was doing her own job and she was asking for my technical expertise in a way that respected my time. And Mr. Harris? At 5 p.m. on the dot, he packed up his briefcase. But instead of the usual casual wave and command, he paused. "Walker, you finishing up?" "Just putting the last touches on the grade verification forms," I replied honestly. He nodded. "Okay. Well, if you need anything, call me. I'll check my work email tonight just in case." He didn't order me to stay. He didn't leave me extra work. He acknowledged my existence and offered his availability, a gesture that was completely foreign to his character a week earlier. That evening, I left the office at 5:15 p.m. No dread. No instant noodles. I walked out into the early evening sun, a normal person leaving a normal job at a normal time. The resolution wasn't them getting fired. The resolution was respect. They learned the fundamental administrative truth the hard way. If you demand perfection but refuse to verify it, you are vulnerable. They had exploited my time and hard work. I had weaponized their negligence and forced them to spend their cherished weekend doing the work they had dumped on me. The consequence was personal, immediate, and utterly effective. I stayed at Northwood High for another year. I never stayed past 5:30 p.m. again. My bosses were meticulous, engaged, and incredibly careful about what they signed. My work-life balance was completely restored. I got my promotion and a significant raise 6 months later, partly because my quick fix to the Q3 report crisis was praised as heroic problem-solving by the district officials, after Albright and Harris were forced to commend me for my late-night work ethic. The power dynamic was permanently flipped. I was no longer the exploited drone. I was the indispensable administrator whose time was truly valuable. Sometimes the system is so rigged that the only way to rebalance the scales isn't through rules or complaints, but through a decisive, perfectly executed act of administrative disobedience. They made me work late and alone, and I made them pay with the only thing they truly valued, their free time. And I got my life back. That's the real happy ending. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the true cost of administrative negligence. If you liked this story about taking back control, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the office hours. And let me know in the comments, what was the biggest administrative nightmare you ever faced?